Good evening from cold New York, where I think 50% of the population is suffering from some form of influenza, just like me. That's what you hear from my voice. I'm Phil Galston, one of the founders of the Council of Music Creators. The CMC is a pure, unified voice of songwriters and composers, the people who create the music that is the foundation of everything audiences and businesses love. Why do we call ourselves pure? Well, because there are only songwriters and composers in our group, music creators, no third-party publishers, for example. We're supportive of, but unaffiliated with ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, or any other performing rights organization. And while many of us wear the hats of performer, engineer, and/or producer, and while we support the drive for their performance rights, we're keeping it simple. We do our best to stand by our motto: inform, organize, protect, songwriters and composers. The CMC firmly believes that knowledge is power. So tonight we want to introduce you to one of the most promising initiatives we've encountered, Fair Trade Music. And here to explain it in detail is its architect, the president of the Songwriters Association of Canada, and the co-chair of Music Creators in North America, a man who is working all over the world to protect the rights of his fellow songwriters and composers, Eddie Schwartz.
Thank you, everyone. Let me start by saying a big thank you to Doug Wood, Phil Galston, and David Wolford for organizing this and for all the work you guys do at the CMC. It's very important work, and of course, as the president and co-chair of a couple of sister organizations, we're looking forward to working with you guys in the future to improve the lot of our fellow music creators. Thanks for the introduction, Phil. Fair trade music is an idea that I like to think can turn the corner on the conversation we've been having about the problems that we're facing as music creators these days. And what I mean by that is that I think a lot of us have been vocal about the problems we face. And that's as it should be, because we face some very serious problems. We'll get into that in a few minutes with this presentation. But I think it's important for us to stop simply talking about the challenges that we face as music creators and start thinking about ways that we can be proactive and empower ourselves to move forward with our situation and make it better for music creators, artists, and everybody in the music value chain. I think the presentation you're about to see is not just about those of us who create music. It's about the entire music value chain and how we can work towards creating a fair one for all parties concerned, fair and sustainable. So, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about how we got here and what some of the problems are as I see them, and then move on to explain why some of us think fair trade music will offer us some solutions. So, I think, you know, there's kind of a fallacy that we all, or that many of us have gone into the music business because we want to be rock stars and make a lot of money. That may be true for some folks, but I think in my case, I certainly wasn't drawn to music, and I think this is true of most of the people that are doing what we do, which is creating music. Most of us aren't drawn to the music business for money. We're drawn to it because we love music, and we can't do anything else. Frankly, that certainly is true in my case. But after being in the music business my whole life, I can certainly say that whether we do it for the money or not, we can't make music without money. Money is just a fact of life, and not only for the making of music, but to sustain ourselves while we're doing that. Just a personal note on the t-shirt. That was taken about 30 years ago, that shot, when I was signed to Atlantic Records. And I'm very proud of the fact that that question, who the hell is Eddie Schwartz, is still as pertinent and topical today as it was 30 years ago. So, again, I don't want to spend a lot of time complaining about where we've been, but I think it's very important for everyone before we get into fair trade music, to understand the principles it's built on, to understand what the problem is. And I think these two round objects on either side of the slide, I think, are helpful in explaining the situation to some extent. So, once upon a time, back in the day, and still, if you can sell a million physical records, or CDs, which is a difficult thing to do, a million sales paid writer's share about $45,000. Of course, that would be split possibly by more than one writer, maybe two or three on it, but that's really what a platinum record generated for the writers. And attaining that level of platinum record was a big deal. It didn't happen every day. So it wasn't millions of dollars. A lot of people think if you had a hit record, you were, pearly gates opened up and you could retire for the rest of your life. I think that's a fallacy that hopefully this puts to rest. So to compare that with the situation we face today, a million streams generates about $35. So that is as close to 100% drop in revenue as you can get. Now that's calculated on statements that I see from a well-known songwriter, see them on a fairly regular basis, and that figure per stream is calculated directly from those statements. This is not a theoretical number that comes from some third-party source. This is confirmed by actual statements that are received by songwriters. So I think it's worth actually saying out loud this per stream value. So it's after the decimal point. A songwriter share is now 0.00004035. So what separates that from piracy, which we've talked a lot about in the last 14 or 15 years, are those last three numbers, the 3-5. And that is so close to zero that many of the people who collect and distribute money on behalf of songwriters round it down to zero. But if you pay that amount of money to a songwriter per stream, it's a legitimate business model. Whereas if you don't, if you just take off the 3 and the 5, it's considered to be piracy. So this is an amount of money that is indistinguishable from that, basically, and that's what we're receiving now. So if you have a million streams, you would receive about $35. So a modest middle class income has been reduced, let's say $45,000 has been reduced to basically an extra large pizza in the current situation. Well, I think it's also worth noting that if you compare this to what some other folks are receiving in the value chain, recently the CEO of one of the best known streaming services paid themselves a bonus of $15 million. That's not their salary, that's not their stock option, that was just a bonus of $15 million. If you go back to the previous slide and do the simple arithmetic, for any songwriter to earn $15 million, you need more people than there are on earth to stream your song. And that's just for you. That's not for any other songwriter in the world. So the extremes in terms of remuneration, I think, are pretty stark. So a couple of things. Why is it legitimate? Is it a question I get from time to time is why is it legitimate, to compare what goes on in the digital world with what went on in the physical space? And I think that streaming actually is a very good example of why these things are comparable, when we can compare what happened when people were actually buying CDs and records with what's happening now in the digital world. Because both owning a CD or a vinyl record provided you unlimited access to the music of your choice. And streaming is now being called the new ownership for the very same reason, because it offers you unlimited access to the music of your choice. So it seems, I think, totally appropriate to compare these two technologies. But I think even the bigger question is, why does the technology you use to access music have any impact on the intrinsic value of the music itself? And I think that's a very important question that we have to ask ourselves. If you went to the gas station and some of the gas came by freight train and some of it came by pipeline, you don't have two different pumps because they're valued differently. In other words, the gas itself has the same value no matter how it got to the gas station. And the question is, why should the intrinsic value of music be affected by how it ends up, how you end up enjoying it? So obviously this is a problem that has been going on for some time, and it's not like we haven't been trying to solve it. But the fact of the matter is that that most of our energies as songwriters have gone into these things, into copyright reform, lobbying government, and into really quite arcane legal arguments about some of these issues. In fact, the fact of the matter is that not only do most politicians not understand copyright, but no matter how much we lobby them, but in fact most creators don't understand copyright. It is a very arcane, very complex area that we lose a lot of people. And not only that, I think there's another issue is that a lot of people feel copyright now was designed more to help large multinational corporations than it is to help international creators. And that we can discuss whether that's true or not, but that's certainly, I think, the impression that many people have. So, because there are so many people lobbying government, because there's so much, there are so many different interested parties that are that go to government and are pulling government in different ways on this issue of copyright, and the fact that copyright itself is to some extent tainted by, as I said, the perception that now, the perception currently that it doesn't really help individual creators. I think what we have is this perennial gridlock at the intersection of copyright and politics. And I think, again, that's not just true in the United States, where I think we certainly had a lot of problems to deal with government. Just think about SOPA, the debacle of SOPA, and how close we came to what some people feel was meaningful change, and how that went away. Basically, 5 years' work was overcome by some very clever work on a company that starts with the letter G. For the most part, about 5 years of work was overturned in 5 days. So clearly, we have a problem in the political sphere. And I don't want anything I'm saying to be construed as that we should stop lobbying or stop having those conversations. We have to continue. We can't abandon the field. But I think we also have come to a place where it's totally understandable to be a little skeptical about how much progress we're going to make with government, either here in the United States or virtually anywhere else around the world in the immediate future. And I think also we have to ask ourselves, how healthy is it for us to continue to rely on that one solution for the problems we face? So I think because of SOPA and some of the other problems we've had, and this continual perennial gridlock at copyright, a number of us in the last few years have felt that we have to find new ways of approaching our problem. And that has brought us to this fair trade music. Now, to understand why fair trade may be helpful in the music space, I think we're going to have to talk about coffee for a second. So, why has fair trade coffee been such a successful, again, initiative, I think, for third world farmers primarily over the last 25 years? It's a very, I think what we've discovered from fair trade and the success it's had is that it's a very, very powerful communication strategy. And the reason it's so powerful is because it gives the consumer a choice at the point of purchase. You have 2 bags of coffee in front of you. One has been certified fair trade, and the other one has not. If you opt to choose the one that has the fair trade logo on it, you know that you are the last link in a virtuous value chain that fairly compensates the people who brew the coffee. So it's a moment where you get to feel good about your decision, and you understand where, as a consumer, you stand in that value equation and your importance in making that decision. So it allows you to feel good about your decision. If you buy the other bag of coffee, you pretty much know that you are the last link in a value chain that is exploitive, and that the farmer will never be properly compensated. And what I think is astounding and argues about a lot of the skepticism about consumers, which we've heard over the last 10 or 15 years, is the remarkable success of fair trade coffee. When you give people, when you communicate to people at the point of purchase a very simple ethical choice, without explaining all the intricacies of copyright, you can either be part of a virtuous and fair value chain or not. It's amazing how many people do the right thing. To the point where corporations these days, some of the biggest distributors of coffee, cannot sell anything but fair trade coffee. That's all that Starbucks sells. Because ultimately, if enough consumers make this choice, these corporations, large corporations that distribute coffee, can't be seen on the wrong side of that equation. Think about what happened with Apple and some of the workers in the Chinese plants recently. Think about garment workers in India and Pakistan and other countries like that. There's people, I think we live in a world now where if you can communicate the fact that there are simple ethical choices to be made and do it at the right time in a way that consumers understand, it can be very powerful. Which brings us, that detour in coffee brings us back to music. So essentially what we're talking about with fair trade music is a system that would inform both consumers and creators who pays and who plays for. So what we would, if you went to one of these streaming services or any number of other ones, they would either be certified by a fair trade music system or not. You would know as a consumer if you are utilizing a service that fairly compensates the creators. But you would also know as a creator if that's a streaming service you'd like to do business with or not. So, fair trade, I'm going to get into a little more of the details of what we're talking about with the fair trade music system. But before I do that, I should actually spend a few minutes or a few seconds or whatever it's going to take speaking about some of the people who are supporting fair trade music at this point. So it's now endorsed by over 25,000 music creators from around the world. And that includes music creators from Africa. The gentleman at the top, Samba Bende, is from Cameroon, Africa. We have music creators here, I won't mention everyone's name, but from South America, Latin America. The gentleman in the middle with the red sweater is Lorenzo Ferraro, who's a composer from Italy. We have composers here. We have Isabel Crack, who is the executive director of the Songwriters Association of Canada. And at the bottom, you can see a gentleman holding a fair trade music t-shirt that was from Tokyo a few weeks ago. So we are getting the word out and working through various music organizations, such as the CMC, all over the world, so that we can build this idea and this initiative everywhere. And I think it's very important that this not only be composers from North America and Europe, but I think the fact that we have songwriters and composers from Africa and Asia and Latin America is very important. We're all facing the same challenges, and we're all dealing with the same global companies. So I think it's very appropriate we're working together on this initiative. So, a little research. Why did we do the research I'm about to tell you about? Because, you know, you may have your thoughts about what's fair. I may have my thoughts about what's fair. But it's very important that I think if we're going to build a fair trade music system, we have some very solid ground to build that on. And that means that we need to get somebody who's worked in this area for many years, who is not a songwriter, who's a third party, who's impartial, to have a look at the value chain that we're talking about in the music industry and come up with some ideas about what is fair, so that it's not simply our opinion, that we have some hard facts, if you will, to build the system on. And so we went to an economist, his name is Pierre Lalonde, and this is a gentleman who has extensive experience in this area. He worked for many years at the Copyright Board of Canada. One of his biggest roles was doing exactly that, was looking at different business models and determining the value of music in those business models, and also determining the splits between the various music rights holders, the rights in the song and the rights in the master recording. After that, he went to Canada's Heritage Ministry, which is the part of government that oversees cultural affairs. And Canada is an interesting country to do this kind of work in, because a gentleman like Monsieur Lalonde, would have to be knowledgeable not only in copyright, which is what we have in America, Canada, the Anglo-American system, English-speaking country, but he's also an expert in authors' rights, which is the regime that exists in Europe and other countries around the world. So he knew both of those regimes. And so the study itself is international in scope. It was done by a Canadian, but it was actually financed by some of the writers' groups around the world, and it is international in scope. And this is the study that Mr. Lalonde has provided us with. This is the work that he did. It's called The Study Concerning Fair Compensation for Music Creators in the Digital Age. And the logos there are two of the prime organizations that worked with him on this. Music Creators North America, which I am co-chair of, and also CIAM, which is the International Council of Music Creators based in Paris. And I'm going to just go through quickly some of the key findings of the study. But it's over a 30-page document, so you can find the entire study at www.fairtrademusic.info, and there's also an executive summary of the study there if you don't want to read the full 30 pages. So I invite anyone watching that or here or wherever you may be watching this to go to that website. It'll come up again, so you can write it down if you don't get a chance to do it now, and look at the full study for yourself. So here are some of the key conclusions that the study has come to. And the first one's not a great surprise. Music is undervalued by streaming services. Now, I haven't put any figures down there because it's undervalued by various amounts depending on the streaming service. And again, you can get into much more detail on this if you have a look at the study itself. But essentially, what the study says is that 80% of the revenue that comes from streaming services should go to the people who make the music. And his methodology is by comparing streaming services with other businesses that use creative content. Now, how undervalued, what is the range of undervalued? Something like 25% to 15%, depending on the streaming service. So it's significant. There's a significant undervaluation of all of the rights in the music value chain by streaming services. And here's another one of the key findings, which I think is a fascinating one. Now, this has to do with known revenue from streaming services. And we'll get to what I mean by that when we get to the transparency slide in a moment. So, on average, 96 cents of every music industry dollar goes to major record labels. Now, I think that's a bit of a revelation, because I think most of us have felt that the streaming services themselves may be the major part of the problem. This may give us pause on that conclusion. This kind of takes the conversation, I think, in a different direction. So, I think it's very important, and Doug and I have talked about this and others, that we don't vilify any of the players in the value chain. We want, ultimately, I just remind everyone who's listening to this, that we would like a fair value chain for all parties, fair and sustainable for all parties. But I think you don't have to be a mathematical genius to see that if one of the parties in the value chain is getting 96 cents out of every dollar, you can check my math on this, that leaves about 4 cents for everybody else. So that creates a pretty difficult situation in terms of fair. I don't think it's possible to get the fair from this kind of split. So the study goes on to look at what would be a fair split. And this is the conclusion, that the division of revenues between the song and the master recording should be 50-50. So 50 cents on every dollar would go to the songwriters, music publishers, and 50 cents would go to the artist and the label. Now, what is this based on? Well, I think we have to remind ourselves that a streaming service is a license. the rights are licensed. And we've been licensing rights for decades. That's not a new activity. Licensing streaming services is new because that's a new technology. But licensing of rights has been going on for a long time. And rights have been licensed at 50/50 for a long time. And sync rights are a perfect example of a split that is 50/50. When a third party, such as, for example, a TV producer, a movie producer, they're looking for music for a production, they come as a third party to the rights holders, and they value the song and the recording equally. They pay equal amounts for each one of for the rights to license each one of those components. So again, the study, this is not drawn out of thin air. The study looks at historical ways of licensing music and splits, and comes up with this 50/50 split between the song and the master recording. So, as interesting, I think, as the conclusions have been in terms of where the money goes on the survey, I didn't know it was Halloween. There's a lot we don't really know about. And other than we know that what the list of revenue sources that are on this slide are not shared with creators. So clearly transparency itself is a huge issue in the music value chain, and one that we have to address. But what we do know is that there are large hidden advances, that there are minimums and guarantees that go to some of the large multinational corporations. Record labels own parts of these streaming services, or some of the services, which I think, as the study points out, puts them in a conflict of interest. I mean, they're on one side, they're on both sides of the equation. They're not only negotiating theoretically on behalf of the artists, and in some cases the songwriters, but they own part of the companies they're negotiating with. So that's, I think, something you may want to give a little thought. One of the other big areas that we know a little bit about, but further study is required, is data mining. It turns out that music is perhaps the best, one of the best, if not the best, way of determining your tastes and consumer patterns of behavior. Because the kind of music you listen to is very indicative of the kind of things you're probably going to like to buy. If you like country music, there's a range of products that you may likely be drawn towards. If you like heavy metal or classical music, the genre of music you enjoy has a tremendous, is very revealing about your patterns of consumer behavior. And that data is worth a lot of money to advertisers. And it is being monetized, and it is not being shared with the people who make the music. So I'm going to just touch briefly on one other finding of the study that I think is really very important, and that is that streaming may well be a $50 billion industry within 5 years. Now, the study itself didn't do research on this, but drew on a couple of other studies that have been done, and this is the conclusion that they have come to. And so there are a number of very reputable firms out there working on this kind of thing, and they feel that it's going to be that big in 5 years. So I think that shows how important it is for us to try to get this right and have a value chain that's sustainable for all parties. If it gets to $50 billion a year, that will eclipse the size of the music business ever in the past, and it'll definitely be the major game in town. So it's very important that music creators are properly involved and compensated in this, and maybe a very large industry going forward. So I'm going to stop there in terms of going through specific findings of the study. As I said, the entire study concerning fair compensation for music creators in the digital age is available at fairtrademusic.info. I encourage everyone who's interested to go there. There's a lot of other information about the value chain, about the specific findings of the study, and if you're interested in this, I think you'll find a lot to engage in there and to educate yourself a little more about where the study's coming from and the conclusions it comes to. So, since this is a system that we're trying to build, the question is, now that we have some of the ideas that I think can form that foundation for a fair trade music system, how do we go from here to fair? How do we start to build this thing? Well, I think the first thing that we have to do is what we're doing tonight, which is reach out to our fellow music creators and build support for fair trade music in our own community. We are scattered around the world. We come from very different countries. We have different copyright regimes. We have different regulatory environments in the many countries that music creators work in. And I think those things have divided us over the course of the last, for many years now. So I think the most important thing that fair trade music offers us initially is it gives us an idea to organize around that is proactive and empowered. We're not just sitting and talking about and complaining, as justified as complaining is at this point, about what's wrong. It gives us a proactive way of moving forward. And I think that's very important. And it gives us a way for all of our various organizations in the United States, Canada, around the world to start organizing around building a fair trade music system and building a sustainable value chain for music creators. And for the first time ever, for us expressing what we think is fair. I mean, all of my life I've had government tell me what's fair. I've had publishers, I've had record labels, I've had lawyers. I've had all kinds of people tell me what they think the deal should be. But we've never spoken with a unified voice about what we think is right, what we think is fair. And I think this is a journey that takes us to a place where we will be able to communicate what we think is the right way that this business should be set up and what a sustainable value chain for everyone is, and including the people who make the music. But, so that's where we start, by organizing and working within our own creative community. But we're not going to be able to do this alone. And the fact of the matter is, I think at the end of the day, we are going to attract other players in the value chain who I think in their hearts want to be fair, want to play fair. I think we need to talk, first of all, to our friends in collective management. We have to talk to, ASCAP, BMI, the collective management organizations around the world. We have to reach out to music publishers. I think there's a lot for them to support in fair trade music, and I think we're going to need their help to build this. I think we have to reach out to independent labels, and I think we need to reach out to the multinationals as well. We need to start having this conversation with them. So we need to reach out to all different sizes of businesses in the value chain. And finally, we need to reach out to the streaming services themselves. Interestingly enough, we already are talking to a couple of different streaming services. I probably shouldn't mention their names, but one of them is one of the biggest streaming services around today, one that everyone knows. And I think to some extent they understand that they've taken a lot of the heat for what is going on. They've gotten a lot of bad press. We don't only have to think about Taylor Swift in recent days. So they've taken a lot of hits about this issue, about whether they're compensating music creators fairly. And I think they're anxious to find a new narrative on this subject as well. So we are taking meetings with some of the streaming services, and we'll be talking to them in the coming days about this initiative and seeing to what extent they would like to get involved with it and help us with it. So alliances and partnerships up and down the value chain, I think, are going to be very important going forward. I don't think this is going to happen in a week or a month. I think this is going to be a long-term, I think we're looking at a 3 or 5 year kind of, trajectory here to actually make this thing work. But, the journey of 1,000 milestones with the first step, and I think that's what we're doing now. So one of the things that I think we will do with these, once we've had these dialogues and are progressing with our dialogues with other players in the value chain, is to set up very simple to understand criteria about what is fair and what is not, what is doable and what is not. Whether we will actually get, a list of things that we all want to see in the future, I don't know. But I think what the study does provide for us is kind of a true north. It gives us a compass of where to start heading forwards. So with that in mind, we can start this journey with some of the partners I talked about, some of the other players in the value chain, and develop criteria that we can all live by that will create a value chain sustainable for all parties. And of course, first and foremost, the people who actually make the music, without which, by the way, none of these other players would exist or have a business at all. So, obviously, I think that this is an idea that, as I said when I started, I think it's very important to whatever extent we can. And I think we can walk a long way down this road. We empower ourselves as music creators to start working on these issues, to develop a narrative that's simple, a simple ethical narrative that everyone can understand, and to start developing that amongst ourselves and then communicating it to these other players in the value chain. And first and foremost as well, the first group, that one that I left out, but I think is very, very important, and that this slide points to, is consumers. I think fair trade music has the potential to create a direct link between the two most essential parties in the value chain: the people who make the music and the people who want the music. Now, we all know, those of us who've been doing this for some time, there's a lot of people in the middle. And again, a lot of those people serve very important functions in the value chain. But if we can communicate through fair trade music directly with the people who want the music and love our music, that will be very powerful. And at the end of the day, coming back to some of the problems we've had with government, governments and politicians tend to do what consumers want. So if we, to the extent that we are successful in forging that relationship with consumers, of finding very simple ethical ways to talk to consumers about the issues without getting lost in the deep, dark woods and complexity of copyright, by finding a simple narrative like this, we can strengthen that bond. And I think that bond between creators and consumers is one that we can build fair trade music on going forward. So that's it. Again, please visit us at fairtrademusic.info for more information. Thank you very much.